among many hospitals called humor therapy. It's a real thing. You see, it was discovered that laughter releases endorphins throughout the body, those chemicals which relieve pain, reduce pain, and give us a sense of well-being. How do you feel after a good belly laugh? Huh? I got to thinking about this. It seems then that God, that infinite being, the ground of being itself, made humans to laugh and to experience pleasure. Cousins and many others besides had discovered something that had been revealed a long, long time ago. Proverbs 17:22 reminds us that a cheerful heart doeth good like a medicine, but a crushed spirit dries up the bones. A cheerful heart, a happy heart, a laughing heart. It's like medicine. You know, in our scripture this morning that I just read, the last part of it, Psalm 16, David, who is the author of this psalm, dwells throughout this psalm, it's only 11 verses long, on the security, the contentedness in his life that he experiences, all because of this trust that he has in God and this confidence that he has in God's commitment to him. The psalm it's like a garden almost of descriptive terms, all of it highlighting just how much happiness and pleasure David feels in his relationship with God. Now, I doubt whether David knew anything about endorphins and how those chemicals affect the brain and so on and so forth. But as he contemplates what God is to him, he can't think of any better word than the word that is described as pleasure. Pleasure and its derivatives, mentioned up to 4 times in this psalm. He sees his relationship with God as a pleasurable experience. And he looks forward to future pleasures, eternal pleasures, he calls them. Now, I'm not yet defining what kind of pleasure this is. We'll get to that. But what I want to establish at the very beginning, that we can say without hesitation, and you might say, well, Bruce, you're stating the obvious, aren't you? I don't know. You think about it. It all depends on your picture of God. I believe we can say without hesitation that pleasure and God can and do go together. Pleasure and God can and do go together. In fact, it's not going too far, I don't think, to say that any pure pleasures that we experience down here on earth, whatever they might be, are but faint reflections of the pleasures that we're going to experience in a new world where the old order of things has passed away. Can you think about that? You and I will be able to experience what cannot be described as any other thing than just pure pleasure. Pleasure, that word that we use, it refers to an experience that feels good, that involves the enjoyment of something or someone. It contrasts, of course, with pain and suffering, which we don't like to experience. Pleasure feels good, but within this definition lies a troubling concept. Because I have been told, and I have told others, and I have heard it said that the motto in life, it seems to be, if it feels good, what? Do it. If it feels good, do it. And of course, we mean that in a negative sense, don't we? When we usually utter that word, that concept. If it feels good, do it, which of course could be used to justify any experience that increases the endorphins in our brains, right? It immediately raises the idea that perhaps there are good pleasures and perhaps there are bad pleasures. Perhaps there are two kinds of pleasures. Hebrews 11:25 tells us that Moses made a choice not to enjoy the what? Pleasures of sin for a season. He rather committed himself to God's people. So you'll notice that this sermon is entitled, If It Feels Good, Part 1. If It Feels Good, Part 1. Of course, there's going to be a Part 2. And we're going to deal a little bit more in that particular message about some of these pleasures that Moses gave up and why he gave them up and why perhaps we should give them up. But today, not today, we're not going to concentrate on that today. Let's concentrate on the fact that pleasure seems to be a fact of life. It's instinctual in us when you really think about it. You know, we have the capacity to enjoy things, to enjoy experiences, to experience pleasure in many, many things in life. If you put a group of children in a room with one ball, and then you go outside to observe, these kids don't have to know each other. What's going to happen in a little bit of time? They're going to figure out how to play a game with that ball, right? They're going to play. That's what kids do. Play and pleasure are never very far apart. Yet Christians have not always been unanimous that pleasure is a good thing. Pleasure to some raises eyebrows, begets warnings of worldliness. Today's message is one in an ongoing series that I'm in the process of presenting, a series on what I call the Adventist lifestyle. You remember we looked at a couple of messages dealing with dress and adornment. But I want to spend a little bit of time talking about another aspect of what we consider to be the Adventist lifestyle, and that is our stand on amusements, on pleasure, on entertainment. How does that fit into a Christian lifestyle? If this sermon was to be given 50 years or more, or farther back than that, I wouldn't be using the word lifestyle. I'd be using the word what? Probably church standards, right? That's how I heard it when I was younger. Church standards. Today, the word lifestyle connotes, I think, a more holistic viewpoint, so I believe it's a better term to use in this context. You know, throughout our rather brief history as a denomination, and really we do have a rather brief history if you look at the whole framework of the Christian faith over 2,000 years, you know, we've occupied less than 200 years of that time. It's not a small amount of time, but in comparison to others, it can be considered as brief. But the Seventh-day Adventist movement, that's what we started out as being, and later becoming what we consider the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We've searched for the right balance in this subject of amusement, pleasure, and entertainment. And in that search, it's always been just a little bit elusive to us. But despite the fact, our viewpoint in regards to what is our standard of pleasure and amusement has always been a mark of us as a people. It doesn't lie way, way in the back, and we consider it completely unimportant. In many of our minds, and sometimes even in our teachings and writings, it's right up there in the front, indicating how important we hold it. And if you were a student in an Adventist private school at any time in the past or remote past, you would know that it was very important. I'll never forget when I was 10 years old and my older brother was a student at Platte Valley Academy in Shelton, Nebraska. Now, this was in the mid-'60s. He had a little tiny transistor radio. You remember those? And of course, he was trying to quietly listen to it in his room there in the dorm. Didn't last long. Boys' dean found it. He confiscated it, and I don't know if he ever got it back. No radios. I remember girls having to kneel to determine where that skirt ended up being in terms of the floor and themselves. I remember going to college where you wanted to get in touch, you wanted to get acquainted with everybody on the first night of our college year. So we'd all go in the gymnasium and music would start and we'd all start marching around the gym because, well, you couldn't dance, could you? Oh, yes. I remember all that and more. And you have your own stories too, I know. At times, the church has been quite specific in detailing the pleasures which we believe are not in harmony with scriptural principles. They include, among others, card playing, dancing, theater going, reading of novels and other fiction, sports, to say nothing of certain types of music. The list can go on. But it is important for us to note that throughout not only our church's history, okay, but the wider history of the Christian faith, the topic of what is appropriate amusements and entertainments, or whether or not any amusement would be consistent with being a follower of Christ, was a matter of discussion, sometimes debate, if not verbally, at least in application and practice. You see, there's nothing new under the sun, Scripture tells us, right? Don't think what we're dealing with today has never been dealt with before, never been talked about before. Oh, the scale might be different, but the principles don't change. It's a knowledge of history that connects us to the past and gives us insight into our present and hopefully helps illuminate the future, what lies ahead. So let's take a short little history tour this morning, shall we? We've already tried to show from the Bible and from life itself that pleasure is not contrary to a proper understanding of God's character. Pleasure and God are not mutually exclusive. Got to understand that. And that for the follower of Christ, pleasure is not a bad word. In fact, it may have a more important place than we ever thought. So, proceeding on the idea that at times the Christian faith has had a real difficult time reconciling pleasure and God together, we have to ask the question, where did the idea that pleasure somehow is wrong for a Christian originate? Where did it come from? Well, some of you will be thinking in your minds, and you immediately want to point the finger at that movement whose very name conjures up thoughts of repression, stuffiness, sour joylessness, and uptightness about anyone who might be having the least amount of fun. Yeah, it was those Puritans. That's where it came from. You know, those people that's dressed in black from head to toe. Came around during the Reformation, during the 1500s and 1600s. Isn't that where we get the word puritanical from today anyway? When we use that word, we generally mean that something or someone is hopelessly out of date, old-fashioned. In other words, it's a pejorative term. It's used to describe, even today, people who are uptight and out of touch with the times. That's where pleasure caught on as a bad word for Christians, right? Wrong. No group has been more misaligned and misinterpreted than the Puritan movement. As a matter of fact, in their own day, listen carefully, the Puritans were, as C.S. Lewis puts it, the very opposite of those who bear that name today. In fact, they were the latest rave, definitely not old-fashioned or passé. They were the angry young generation demanding a clean sweep of the medieval